Hi there, I'm Wendy McCallum, burnout and alcohol coach and wellness expert, and you're listening to Bite Size Balance, where everyday extraordinary women share their stories, expertise, and wisdom, all in the name of lifting each other up and creating a better life by design. Whether it's wellness, career, relationships, food, alcohol, mindfulness, hormones, or parenting, we talk about all things women's balance. If your life looks great on paper, but it still feels like something's missing, you're in the right place. Welcome to Bite Size Balance.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Bite Size Balance. I have a really fantastic guest today. I have my friend Julia Anderson here. Now, I want to introduce Julia, but before I do that, I want to tell you a little bit about how I know her. Julie and I ended up in the same Writing Your Recovery course, September of last year, so well over a year ago. And we only met in person for the first time a couple of months ago at a writing retreat that we went to. So we're going to talk about the writing, but we're also going to talk about all kinds of other really fantastic topics that I think are going to be super interesting for you guys to hear about. Julia is probably one of the most impressive women I've ever met. And when we got to know each other better at our retreat a couple of months ago, I asked her whether she'd be willing to come on this podcast because we had such interesting conversations while we were out hiking and having coffee and just kind of hanging out that weekend. And I thought she would make a fantastic guest. So let me tell you a little bit about Julia before I bring her on. Julia is the Chief Executive Officer for the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, CanWaCH. She has over 15 years of senior and executive level experience in international development, not-for-profit, civil society, human rights, and gender equality. Julia works closely with multiple stakeholders on international development policy-related issues, from Canadian and global decision makers to young leaders. In 2019, Julia spearheaded the shaping of a renewed collective vision by Canada's global health sector that resulted in a $14 billion 10-year investment by the Government of Canada. As the CEO of CanWaCH, she continues to champion bold and innovative and even disruptive approaches to advancing the health and rights of women and girls around the world. Julia holds a Master's of Arts degree in the Canadian and Indigenous Studies from Trent University and an Executive Certificate in Conflict Management from the University of Windsor Law School. Hi, Julia. How are you?
I'm great. It's a beautiful day out here. I'm a little bit jet lagged after just getting back from Southeast Asia. So I've had about 5 hours of sleep. So hopefully I'll make sense today.
Oh, gosh. Well, I'm in menopause, so I'm probably samesies. We're actually not that far apart. I was just telling Julia before we hit record that I'm in Ottawa recording this podcast from an Airbnb because my daughter is still sick with mono. And actually, the last time I saw Julia, she had just gotten super sick and just gotten diagnosed with the mono. That was like, what, over a month ago, hey? Must be like, I'd say 6 weeks. I kept saying 2 months but I think it's probably been about 6 weeks. Anyway, she's been sick for a while. And I'm now back up in Ottawa recording this from a rental. So hopefully the sound quality is good today. All right. So Julie, I want to start. I did record your official bio intro before this, but let's just start because we're probably going to be all over the place today. I think it's going to be a really fun conversation. I said in that intro that you're one of the most accomplished and interesting women that I've ever met, and no pressure. But the reason I wanted to talk to you today is because we have this nice combination, I think, which we discovered on the writing retreat, which we'll talk about. But I think we discovered that we have just a nice natural connection as two humans, but we also there's a lot of alignment in terms of how we think and what matters to us. And so I thought we could have an interesting conversation. And then on top of that, of course, you've just got all these cool things going on in your life that I think are just really amazing. And I want to share that with all the listeners as well. So why don't we start with how we met? Do you want to tell that story?
Sure. Well, and it's funny because we've known each other, I think, for a year.
Yeah.
But I had a major clarification when we were together on retreat because I thought you were involved in the writing project from a completely different vantage point. Oh, yeah. So we both joined something called Writing Your Recovery, was the first version of it. And I had found it through my therapist who had recommended, I said, I love writing and I was looking for a creative outlet. So she said, you should join this thing. And it was framed a fair bit, I think, around alcohol recovery and women in recovery from addiction. But her pitch to me, because I didn't so much identify, though I had given up alcohol, her pitch to me was, but you can be recovering from anything. And I said, well, I'm a recovering evangelical Christian, so does that count? And she said, absolutely. And then we joined, and you were on the first call, but we did a go around and everyone was talking, and I thought that you were supporting Anne, the facilitator, and Joseph Johnson in the course. Like, I thought you were like the course helper. And then the way that you approach things, because you were just so helpful and also asked smart questions about not only the logistics, or not only the substance of the course, but the logistics. I believed that all year, that you were like Anne's partner in like delivering the course. And then I found out that in fact, you had just found the course and started writing and you introduced yourself as a non-writer, which also led me to believe that you were there to help with the course, not as a writer. And then you just produced this beautiful writing. And I was like, well, she's obviously a writer and a helper. And
not a helper.
A year later that's not true.
Yeah, no, I definitely was never a helper in that course. Dowsett Johnston, our writing teacher, has been on this podcast before. I had her on last year. That's who we're talking about. But I think that's so funny. I think I probably am just like a bit of a busybody, and I just like make myself seem as though I know more than I do. But I was just in that course like Julia was to try to fill a creative hole. And I had no idea that it was going to be as fulfilling as it was. And I heard Julia read a first piece, which was about her evangelical Christian upbringing. And I was just so drawn into the story, maybe because the piece was talking about being a vegetarian and how hard that was in your family. And I'm a vegetarian, and it was funny, but it was also really real. And I just got such a good sense from that one piece that you read the first time you read about how complicated that life must have been and how complicated it must have been to extricate yourself from it. And then also it was just so obvious to me, even though I didn't know you, how accomplished you were as a professional woman and also with your family and everything else. And I just thought, wow, there must be a really cool story here about how this woman got from that to where she is now. And so every class, I've said this to you afterwards, but every class I was hoping you'd read something, and you have such a busy life that you didn't always read, but I would always hope that Julia would read something because I wanted to learn more about that story. So we went for 12 months, I guess, of not seeing each other face to face. And there's a group of us, there were about 7 or 8 of us. And then we had a writing retreat at the end of, oh gosh, now when was it? In October, mid-October. Yeah. Writing retreat in California. And I think there were 6 of us who went. I might have that wrong. Anyway, group of us went, and Julia and I met in the Toronto airport and flew from Toronto to California together, and then rented a car. So it was like trial by fire. We were just thrown in together and rented a car. And then Julia advises me at the rental car place that she's like blacklisted from car rentals. And then
like, hopefully this works.
She's like, I hope this works, because actually I've been blacklisted because I had a rental car stolen from outside of my house at one point. Anyway, we proceeded on to the retreat. And then over the course of the writing retreat, which was just really so wonderful in so many different ways, we got the chance to do a lot of things outside of the actual writing together, which was really fun, including Julia's quite the go-getter when it comes to organizing physical fitness activities. So she had hiking. I think we went hiking 3 times, got lost at least once, maybe twice. And then just spent a lot of time together hanging out in between the writing sessions and at dinners and that kind of thing. And then on the way home, this is what led to the podcast, is that on the way home, we ended up in the airport again for a while together, waiting for our flight, and just started talking about some of the kind of more bigger women's issues and the burnout stuff. And we hadn't talked about that all weekend. And that's when I thought you'd be just a fantastic person to come on the podcast and and talk, because we do have both the personal connection, but I think also some alignment in terms of the professional stuff and what matters to us. So that's enough about that. What I really want to go back to the evangelical church thing, because again, this is the piece that this is how you drew me in. And now I know so much more about this. And it's such an amazing story. And I would love it if you would because you're now, I did read your professional bio before we started. So people know where you are now, and you're in this, very kind of amazing position with an organization that works internationally. You've just come back from Thailand, and I want to talk about that. You have this huge job. You have a pretty incredible family. And there's also all these other pieces to the story. So do you want to just do a monologue style and tell us how you got to where you are now, in terms of what it was like to be in that evangelical church, and what was involved in leaving it, and how it plays into where you are now? Because I think it's just so interesting to me, all of this. It's a big question. I'm sorry. Just take your time with it.
No, I was going to say, stop me if I ramble, because I could talk forever about this subject. I was raised in the evangelical church. So the evangelical movement is very broad. There's a lot of churches, Christian churches. There's the Protestant movement, the Catholic movement, and within the Protestant movement, evangelicalism is very specific. So when you think of, if anyone ever saw Jesus Camp, or if you think of the movement in the United States that's really has driven the anti-choice work, anti-abortion work, that is the evangelical right. And so when I always say that I was raised in the deep South of Northern Alberta. I tried to get that line in when I met with to name drop the Prime Minister last week, but I couldn't quite fit it in. But I do think, Alberta is this very special place that is culturally distinct from the rest of Canada. I was raised in Grand Prairie, Alberta. My family farm is in Southern Alberta. My parents and a very huge extended family are all around there. And when I moved out here to Ontario, I realized how, I experienced culture shock, because the evangelical church and the Christian movement and the conservatism, the special brand of conservatism that is in Northern Alberta and Southern Alberta, and really makes up a lot of the zeitgeist, the way of being out there, it's unique and it's different. And I think people have a hard time wrapping their head around just how entrenched it is in people's lives out there. So you have, in the extreme connections to racism, you have the only Ku Klux Klan town in Southern Alberta, that exists in Canada and kind of has that identity. You have the gun movement is very prevalent out there. So all these things, right? It's just a different place. And I was very much entrenched in that culture. I went to a non-denominational church that was similar to maybe a Pentecostal church, if people are aware of the main name brand churches. But for me, I'm a person who takes on things like a chameleon and very much becomes, as my grandfather used to say, I don't just ride the bus, I have to drive the bus. And so when I was an evangelical Christian, I really was the highest converter and the one in front of the church giving testimony, and the one that we were allowed to baptize if we were spiritual mentors. So I really embraced and engaged with it in a whole of body, spirit, and mind way. And so bringing myself out of it and excommunicating myself was a heavy lift. And I'm now the CEO of an organization, the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, and we stand for the rights of women and children, which means we tackle head on issues like abortion, issues like women's rights to reproductive justice, but also all the things around that. So now I stand on stages and preach the virtues of feminism in, I think, the most, upfront way possible. And so that transition and that transformation from, attending all-night prayer vigils for unborn children that are being, in the mind of the people I was with, murdered by their mothers and wearing the earrings, although I wasn't allowed to have my ears pierced because that was also part of the whole evangelical, one version of the evangelical movement. But, we wore the jewelry of the little feet, all that kind of stuff, which I now look back on and just I can't picture what was going on in the minds of the women around me and the adults around me that would bring me to those things. But I understand I understand how consuming it was. So I was part of the church. I was a leader in the church. I was identified as a young leader. And as a woman, I think I was given a ton of space compared to a lot of churches to stand up in front of hundreds of people, to become a spiritual mentor. But slowly, as I emerged into, going to secular high school and making friends and connecting with people, I wondered from a future looking perspective, if I were to become a missionary, if I were to become continue down my leadership journey, where that could land me. And it was clear that in the church that I went to, I could be a youth pastor, a children's pastor, but I could never be the head pastor. And I could never be a true preacher, a true ordained preacher, and I could never be an elder. So I could never be a true leader, the boss of the church. And I was somewhat uncomfortable with that. I had friends who were identified within the LGBTQI community, and I saw the struggle that they were undergoing to try not to be themselves. And, some ended up in hospital, very dramatic. And then I just started to question, I think, through a whole series of things, how this way of us and them and thinking that was so consuming and so all-encompassing, how could we be the only ones that were right? If we look at this big wide world, and my eyes, as I open to it, would look around and go, is it really possible that, the 2% of the population that are not, because we didn't believe Catholics were going to heaven. Like we didn't believe, like it was a very small us. And a very big them. And so, just to kind of like wrap my head around how could we what kind of God would give only us the answers or the truths and allow deceit to be running wild amongst all the rest of the population of the world. Started to question and unpack things. I became a vegetarian, and I told my story to the group about that. I fell in love with a cow, and my uncle told me, dispelled the myth about where the steak on my plate came from, told me it was my cow, which was traumatizing. A lot of people have a similar experience, but I don't think he realized that I didn't know that meat came from animals because we were farm kids, but I grew up in the north and the farm was in the south, and I just hadn't paid attention to that detail before. And when he told me, it was heartbreaking. So I decided to become a vegetarian, and I always say it was a slippery slope from vegetarianism to leaving the church completely. And my grandfather said that perhaps I should start a cult called the Cult of the Sacred Cow, because my vegetarianism seemed to open this space of all kinds of things to me, which I think it did, right? And I regret none of it. And I thank the church for teaching me how to be a leader and giving me a lot of opportunities, teaching me how to be in community. I've never found the kind of community that existed within that church. It was a beautiful thing that my parents had, that my family had, that I don't think is replicated in the secular world, but I at least know what I want when it comes to that kind of community. But I regret, a lot of the decisions I made when I was young, and especially because I have a personality that can carry people along. I think I did a lot of damage. I remember raising my hand when my teacher asked, and I was 16, so I knew what it meant. And I raised my hand when my secular high school teacher asked, do you think people who are gay should, it should be illegal? And I raised my hand and said, yeah, and they should go to jail, and it was like this fundamental belief inside me that this evil existed in homosexuality that I hadn't even by that time walked myself out of. It was a quick journey once I met people and connected with people. But I see the damage I did, and I think I'm glad I got out when I did. But I don't take lightly the power of the church to really do a lot of harm, right? And there was good in it as well, but I make no apologies for being very, very sensitive to evangelical ways of knowing and being, and really being on the lookout for that kind of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing so honestly. When you first explained all of this to me, there were a whole bunch of things that stood out to me, but one thing I have been thinking about ever since we had this conversation is how that understanding that you eventually came to around how you had been and how that might not have served you or other people, and the harm that you may have done, as you say, how that informs who you are now and how you go through the world now and how you do the job you do. Like, I just can't see how it's not informing it. And I wonder, like, what do you think about that? Am I off base there? It feels to me like it has to be something that's actually really served you going forward, that experience and learning that.
I think it has served me 100%. I don't think you're off base at all. I think I was trying to write a piece and I haven't got there yet, but maybe I will. Maybe this podcast will help me unlock it. Around, my aversion even to feminism as a way of knowing. And I think it's an aversion to any, I can smell the cult in so many ways of thinking. And I often describe my experience as cult-like. I'm careful I'm careful with that language, but I do think it's hard to get across something that consumes you so with so much fire of your whole being, that you can't imagine being anywhere else or anything else or thinking any other way. And so I'm very avoidant of identities in general, and even vegetarianism and anything that becomes, I am this, and that determines 90% of the way I think, or, like anything that starts to get into those threshold over majority, I'm very sensitive to. The book, Adam Grant's book, Think Again, just resonated so deeply in me. And it was a forced teaching, and I think a forced learning to me because of the extreme way that I was raised and had to completely rethink everything. But I think there's lessons in that about everything from ego and how we operate in the world to just what we're hearing and the bubbles that we surround ourselves in. And we've seen it with misinformation and disinformation in the way that people just get lost in rabbit holes. And so I'm often like, am I lost right now? Or am I seeking out different enough information? And I really maintain a sensitivity to that. And at the same time, so coming back to, having to rethink assumptions, I was just traveling in Cambodia, and I visited a project that was run by a faith-informed organization, the Seventh-day Adventists. And I went in with a very strong sense that that type of organization could not do what we called SRHR work, so sexual reproductive health and rights work, which is the big focus of the Canadian government's work. And I was like, oh, well, they won't do real SRHR. And because they're faith informed, and like my assumptions just locked into place, and it was like just so obvious to me. And what I saw when I was there was quite the opposite. I saw an organization incredibly committed to women and women's health, and that means women's health in all the ways that women may need healthcare, including access to abortion, including, good, grounded reproductive education, reproductive health education, good adolescent work around choice and consent, and, and all these things. And I was like, okay, wow, my evangelical roots, I think, would have stopped me from engaging with this, for believing it if I had seen it on paper. But I opened my eyes and I was like, okay, you got to rethink those assumptions, right? Even if the way that I was raised was very specific, and the way I took it on was also very specific. I think of my sister, my brother, who's still part of the church, my mother, they would hear this and think, well, no, we weren't that extreme, or no, she's not accurately representing. We didn't think that way. Women were allowed to be leaders. It's like, well, there's facts in there too.
Yeah, it's really, I just feel like it probably just from everything you've told me, it sounds like it led to a tolerance for both sides that wouldn't be there. So for the more evangelical side of any issue, and also tolerance for those who are not on the other side. I'm not saying this very clearly, but also curiosity, which seems to be a big piece of how you go through the world, which I think is so cool. And the other thing that I noticed about you, and this was really the thing that it really made me think, I really, really like this woman, was because I don't do this, and I've never done this, and I should do this, and I want my daughter to do this. But I was so moved by how much your own future and what you want for yourself informs the decisions you make now. And I think a lot of women don't go through the world that way. I definitely didn't. But when you talked about how, you realized, oh, I'm never going to be the actual leader of this church. That's not possible for me. There's a glass ceiling here, and it's really obvious to me. I'm going to leave. I was like, wow, that's just so, I know it seems like the obvious thing for you to do, but I don't think it's the obvious thing for a lot of women. And so I really loved that. And then when you went on to tell me, which I hope you'll share a little bit about your story of leaving the church and how what happened after that. I know that the decisions that you made there in terms of, what you studied, where you went, who you decided to be with as a life partner, that those are all also connected to what you wanted for yourself in your future. And I think played in as a very significant driving factor for you, as it should. But I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it always does. So what happened? You left the church, and then what happened?
So I left the church, and the way that I chose to tell my parents that I left the church was that I was having sex before marriage, which there's a few ways to really signal in the evangelical movement as a young woman that like you're done, like that you're like, and one of them would be to join some sort of satanic cult, and the other would be to have sex before marriage. Like there's it really is the purity culture is real, and especially for young women. And to be like, I'm doing this on purpose. Like I'm choosing I like to have sex. I want to be doing this. No one's coercing me. Like, this is what I want to be doing. So of course I was very elegant in my disclosure to my parents. And I said, I've left the church and I'm having sex with someone, which is not, I don't think something that an 18-year-old normally tells their parents when I guess my daughter told me when she became sexually active, but we had a different relationship. It's not a normal thing in the community that I was raised, because people, including my best friends and my cousins and my family, they would not have had sex before marriage, like would not probably have seen genitals of the other sex. They would not have touched them, certainly not a French kiss. Like it was a pretty extreme version of purity culture. So I was having sex before marriage. I told my parents this. My dad said, okay, well, don't get AIDS and don't get pregnant. 3 months later, I did not have AIDS, but I was indeed pregnant. Abortion was an option. It was accessible to me, and I was aware of its accessibility to me. I think the stage that I was in leaving the church, I was not in my head. It didn't play out as an option, a viable option, because it was a big, like, Jesus was still in my bedroom, even though I always describe it as like an awkward threesome when I was having, because this purity culture existed still in my body and in my head. Mm-hmm. At some point I wrote it, and maybe this is too graphic, but like right down to my clitoris, like Jesus was part of the sexual experience, and not in a good way. And I was already, I was just processing and exiting in such a way that the pregnancy I decided within minutes of finding out that I would have this child. And my aunts and my mom and my family reacted with a kindness and a generosity to that. I think because I chose to have her, and that was important to them. But also because they love babies and they love people and they love humans, and they're generous spirits. So I got pregnant. I had my daughter. I got pregnant when I was 18, had my daughter when I turned 19. She is now 21, turning 22 soon, and an amazing human being. But that really, because I was pregnant, I mean, I had told my parents I was having sex before marriage, but I hadn't like necessarily told everyone that, but pregnancy gave it away. And what my other grandfather said is lots of people are doing it, but some girls just get caught. And I thought the girls was a really funny, like the girls get caught, the boys don't get caught, because who knows if it's their baby. But yeah, then it was a quick kind of, from there, really clear exit. I wrote the letter and excommunicated myself from the church that I had been a part of. It hurt a lot of people and disappointed a lot of people, especially because I'd been this young spiritual mentor, which was actually it's not a formal position, but it was a thing. And they took a bit of a risk on allowing me to do it. And then that risk failed. And that wasn't lost on me, that for the next generation of young women, they'd be like, oh, well, that Julie. And I changed my name from Julie to Julia. But that Julie, I'd be a tale that went down in history as why you don't let young women lead, because they might go off and get pregnant, which it's a tale as old as time. Yeah.
And so you left and you had your daughter, and then are you just on your own? Where are you and what's happening?
So I wanted to be a missionary my whole life. I had to readapt that plan, and I knew I wanted to do international work. My passion was for seeing the world, being part of the world, engaging with, I think, equality and equity work, which was a thread that went through from the time I was young. My grandparents were missionaries. My family were missionaries. It was, a twist on something that was very important as part of my family lineage. So I went to study international development. And at that time I was at West. The only places to study it were in Ontario. So I was like, well, let's move to Ontario. And I got into 3 universities. Had no idea that University of Toronto was a more prestigious university than Trent University, where I chose to go. Albertans don't think like that. No one goes to school. The percentage of your graduating class that go to university is very low compared to Ontario. So you don't have that mentality. So I was like, Peterborough looks like a nice town. So I moved to Peterborough, Ontario, drove my little Ford Escort out with my two-month-old little girl. And we set up shop here, and I stumbled through my undergraduate degree. It was incredibly challenging. My daughter, Oceana's father, came with me. We split up during that time, but he sort of was in and out of supporting her. And I really wanted her to have a relationship. He's from out here. So I really wanted her to have a relationship with him. And that's, I think, was a good choice, although a challenging one. Yeah. And then eventually my dad got a job offer out here. So then my whole family moved to Ontario as well. And that, was a game changer in terms of actually being able to get through and do what needed to be done. And it became the flop house for my various breakups, as 20-year-olds have breakups and need support. And I tried to do it a little bit more sensitively, given I had a daughter with me, but it was amazing to have them here with me. And got through university, got my first job in international development with a little international development organization that worked in Kingston, Jamaica, in Peterborough and Kingston, Jamaica. So spent a lot of time with a lot of amazing partners in Kingston doing anti-violence and education work. And then sort of went through, a career path all over the place. But I knew, as my friend said, who was a friend that I used to bartend with when I was in university trying to make ends meet. And she's like, you're the CEO of an organization. You told me that that's what you'd want to do. And I was like, I don't remember saying that, but here I am. I indeed have landed.
So it's so, to me, I just want all girls to have that mentality that you have. I just love it so much. And maybe this comes from my own underconfident past, but I just think it's so amazing that you knew what you wanted to do. I love how the work you were going to do with the church informed the work that you did after you left. I think that's just so interesting. And it just speaks to your values, like your personal values and what really matters to you. I just think that's so interesting how that ended up turning out for you. So can you tell us a little bit about CanWaCH? Because you're the CEO now of CanWaCH, which is a big deal, people. Julia, as she said, was just in Southeast Asia. And I'd love to hear a little bit about the work that you're doing there and the organization itself and your role there.
So CanWaCH is the Canadian Partnership for Women and Children's Health, and we are a coalition. So if you think of the Dairy Farmers Association, or you think of the various professional associations that exist, we're sort of like that for all the organizations, research institutions, and companies who are Canadian-based, but work internationally on women and children's health. So the big names that you know, UNICEF, World Vision, Care Canada, Red Cross, these are the organizations that you see infomercials about that do work in low and middle income countries, sometimes called developing countries, really trying to work with the most marginalized women and children to advance equality and equity. And, you know, we saw during the pandemic, just the devastating, this was a pandemic that attacked women in particular, in all kinds of ways, from violence against women was on the rise when women were at home all over the world, to the economic fallout. Usually in economic recessions, women actually fare about equal to men, but in this recession, we're seeing women leave the workforce, as I'm sure you've talked about on the podcast, in just droves and not coming back, and what that's going to do to families and communities. And, you know, that woman who has lost her precarious work and in a violent relationship, you know, that's the worst case, but there's so many similar situations that are on the edge of that. And so the organizations we work with are trying to address that in a whole manner of ways, from building health clinics and hospitals to doing gender equality work, to all kinds of things. So we support them, and our job is to advocate for them. So that was my meeting with the Prime Minister, talking about the amazing work that our members are doing to advance gender equality around the world. We do data work. So if you have a look at our website, you can see a map of all the Canadian organizations doing work internationally and the work that they're doing. You can click on them and just see the amazing stories and breadth of Canadian presence. The good of Canadians around the world, I think, is really interesting. And then we bring people together and we try to say, okay, we have a limited and a finite number of resources. How can we best use these to make the most impact? Is that in this particular community, they're saying they need this? Where are other examples of where there's interventions that are serving that? How can we learn? How can we exchange knowledge? How can we work together and collaborate? So that's our role. And I work with an amazing team of about 20 folks, and then a membership of over 100 organizations and thousands of staff within those organizations to do that work.
Yeah. And I want to talk to you about the whole keeping your balance piece, because this podcast is about burnout and balance. So we're going to talk about that in a second. But before we get to that, I want to ask you, as a female CEO, and this is just totally driven by curiosity. I work with all kinds of women in high leadership positions, in my role as a coach, but also in the work that I do with corporate wellness and that kind of thing. So I have my own thoughts on this, but I want to hear it straight from the mayor's mouth. Oh my. I want to hear it from you. What do you think some of the particular challenges are of being a female in that kind of leadership role? Are there things that are different about it? Are there things that you've noticed that you didn't expect, that are really driven by your gender?
Oh, so many things. There are so many things. I mean, I think if you read the popular culture or the literature that's, you know, LinkedIn, go to LinkedIn and look at the top 20 management consultant type folks who are talking about leadership right now, you'll see all this information, a plethora of stuff around, well, it's the women, it's the moment for women. Women's leadership is what's needed right now. It's better. It meets the needs of this very particular workforce that we have, because it's, emotionally in tune. There's high emotional intelligence. That's what employees are looking for. You'll just see so much, and you're reading it, you're going, yeah, it's my moment. And then you look around, or you sit in a meeting where it's you and a male CEO, And you go, oh no, nothing's changed. Because they're still referring to him with the tough questions and asking me about my feelings. And they're still, deferring to him as well, like Nick said, when really I said it. Nick was my colleague who absolutely, was enraged by this, but we run similar organizations. So he's a coalition, I'm a coalition. And we did all kinds of meetings together, and he's exactly my age. We're similar education. And this would happen all the time. Nick would say something profound. I would say something different, profound. And then everyone would be like, as Nick said.
All the profound stuff is Nick's.
Like, wait a second. No, like I said that, right? And I see it happen all the time and all over the place. This notion that, or someone reframing what you've said as if when it comes from them, it makes more sense because even though you've just said it, right? And I really find that disconnect between what you're reading and what we know is needed, and then the experience of actually being a woman in leadership. And statistically, if you look, like I have some numbers, so 35% of management occupations are held by women. Like that's not 50%. We're not coming up to 50%. We're still well below. 4% of Canada's largest traded companies have a woman CEO. 4%. Like that's 96% that are not women.
Yeah.
Like that's crazy, if you think about it. So you're like, okay, so if this is our moment, how come the poster of the top 500 still there isn't one woman? Like I was in the finance department looking at that we now have a female finance minister, but it's the first one. It's just walls of men, walls of white men too, right? Like I think that's, there's, and as a white woman, I think I need to be very aware of that too. My glass ceiling is quite different than it is for women of color. And how is me shattering my glass ceiling, creating space for them? And I take that responsibility, but also that challenge really seriously, because I think there's many intersectional conversations that need to be had.
Yeah. Those statistics are just staggering, but at the same time, not remotely surprising to me as someone who's come out of the corporate world and still spends a lot of time in it.
Yeah.
So, I think connected to that, to those statistics, a piece of this is that the playing field may have been leveled in principle, but it hasn't been leveled in fact or in reality. And a piece of that, and this is the work that I do, I think is connected to the responsibilities that women have that men maybe don't have in the same way or don't carry in the same way, and how we need to work. How it's sometimes much more challenging for us to balance all of the various pieces of the load that we carry. And one of the things that I really was impressed with you, which is again, another reason why I wanted to have you on today, is that it was very clear to me in the time that I spent with you in those 3 days we were away, 4 days, that you prioritize your own wellness in a way that most women don't. Mm-hmm. And I thought, okay, if this woman who is as busy as she is, because you also haven't told people how many kids you have. So can you just share that before we, because it's not just the work people, there's a whole other emotional load happening for Julia.
Yeah, so I have two, the most amazing stepkids in the world, who are 23 and 21. And my daughter's 21. And then I have a 10 and a 7-year-old as well that we had together. So it's a yours, mine, and ours situation. So 5 altogether. We did live together in the during the pandemic, but now sadly the older ones have moved on, making my life slightly different emotional labor wise, but more difficult because I have no childcare.
Right. Yeah.
They were amazing mini parents. They are amazing mini parents.
So, managing everything that goes along with that, with living in a house, having a family, whether they're living with you or not, that involves 5 children, is huge. And then on top of that, you're doing this big job and you're super busy and you're managing also and caring for this big staff. So you got a lot of caregiving responsibilities happening all at once here, and to include caring for the organization, caring for the staff, caring for your kids, caring for your partner, caring for yourself, caring for aging parents. All of that stuff's all happening at once. And I was just so impressed with how it was so clear to me that you make sure when you are, certainly when you're traveling, that you take care of your own needs, and that you were the one who organized the hikes, told us where they went and where they were happening, said, you're welcome to join me, but I'll be leaving at this time. Helped to organize all the food to make sure we had delicious, healthy food to eat, and that you as a vegetarian had something awesome to eat. And me, thank God, benefited from that as a vegetarian. And you just seem like you've got a handle on setting boundaries and saying no and not taking on too many extra things. And I was just really, really impressed with that, because of course the work that I do is largely with women who are still struggling with that or working on that. So can you talk a little bit about how you've prevented, because you and I had a discussion, you were like, I don't know, maybe I am burnt out. Maybe I'm getting like, no, I don't think so. That's my expert opinion on this, is that you're actually doing a pretty awesome job of managing stress and of maintaining a balance that works for you. And everyone's place of balance obviously is different. So can you talk about like why you think that is and what you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, it was a funny conversation, because I was like, I don't know, maybe I'm missing something. Like, I'm always afraid that I'm just out of touch with my own body. And I just had this whole hormonal workup done on, and they looked at my cortisol and my sugar and like all my melatonin, like all the hormones, everything. Mm-hmm. And the person was like, yeah, you're good, except for your B12 and your D, and like, you're really managing stress well. And I was like, okay, like I thought so, but I don't know, because again, there's this pervasive culture around, not a lot of people are talking about what it looks like to be okay, right? Because so many people aren't okay. And I just want to acknowledge that I see that with my team. I see it with the thousands of, I talk to the CEOs of the thousands of employees that are in our circle, in our community, the leaders, the non-leaders, like people are not okay right now. And I just want to acknowledge that. But then on the flip side of that, it's hard to know, it's hard to see when you are okay. And it's like, no, they're like, what's the model for being okay? So how I do it, I mean, for me, the being outside, physical exercise, the hikes, the sun, these pieces, like I get I go so quickly into low mood, and I don't like being sad. I don't like having low mood. And so I'm kind of avoidant of it. And I just go there so quickly if I don't get those things, and if I don't connect, and if I don't have that, my friendship, my really active friendships, and my really active community and engagement, and my team's not in a good place, like all those things, I have to keep equilibrium. And I know how to do it. I know what makes me happy. And I learned early on that I'm not good at like team sports, organized sports. Like my things are going to be on my own. I don't race. I don't like bring competition into the things that bring me physical benefit, with the exception of Orange Theory, which we both love. And with my jet lag, I've been taking advantage of the 5 a.m. classes because I'm wide awake. But, like I don't bring competition into it. I just try to really focus on my exercise being purely for enjoyment. Mm-hmm. And I get such quick releases from those pieces. And then being a vegetarian, like you have 2 choices. You can either be what I call the college girl vegetarian, which is like pasta and bagels. Mm-hmm. And you'll feel the effect of that pretty quick in your body. Or you can start cooking for yourself. When I was a vegetarian in Northern Alberta, like no one was cooking for me. People hated me. Like I got yelled at on the street for being a vegetarian. Like my cousin would not set me up with a very handsome friend of his, because he's like, deal breaker, you're a vegetarian. Like that's, you might've left the church. That's one thing, but like you're a vegetarian, like there's a line that you can't cross with the Albertan boys. And that was one of them. So I had to leave Alberta to start dating. But yeah, I think it led me down a pathway of healthy food and good food, and just being able to feel that difference. I remember especially when I quit red meat, man, was that a quick, like my body just was like, whoa, yeah. It's still the one thing I crave 25 years later, but my body really responded quite well. And then, like you, I gave up drinking. And I think that's a whole nother story, and we can decide whether we want to go into it. But hormonally and balance and equilibrium and energy. That was a game changer for me a couple of years ago. And
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that, because it was a question, but it's come up organically here in that it's so weird. When I joined the Writing Your Recovery course, I did not assume that everybody who was in there was sober. And I don't even like to use the word sober. I'm just using it because people understand what it means. But that I just thought people were recovering from different things, because of course we have people writing about all kinds of different topics. I'm not writing that much about drinking. I write mostly about recovery from modern motherhood and from infertility and recurrent pregnancy loss and all kinds of other topics, but not very much about drinking. And so I did not make that assumption about you. So when you read a piece about drinking, the first time I heard you talk about it, I thought, oh, her too. I didn't know that. So, and your story, I think I want you to share your story, because my story is different in that different from a lot of people's, everyone's story is different, but my story is different from a lot of the guests that I have on this podcast, in that I didn't hit any kind of obvious rock bottom. There was nobody objectively thought that I had a problem with alcohol. No one ever said to me, hey, you should think about cutting back or quitting. Like, none of that stuff happened for me. And so I think our stories are closer. And I love to celebrate anybody who makes the positive choice to drink less or stop drinking, if that's what serves them. And so I would love it if you would just share a little bit about what led to you making that decision a couple of years ago.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was fun to write that story, and I wrote it inspired. So one of the things that I love about the writing group is even, in framing out a piece, because some of us are working on chapters and some of us are working on pieces. And in framing out a piece, you had read yours, and I was like, went away and was like, okay, now I'm going to write mine, because I saw that similarity, but also I felt like there was a story to be told there. So for me, there was zero alcohol growing up, zero. Like I saw my parents gather with hundreds of people, engage, have fun, have a full life, and there was zero alcohol. I never saw my parents drink until I was a teenager. And I think that's when they had first started drinking. And even then it was so occasional and not the center of anything. And so for me, I saw this whole version of adulthood that didn't include alcohol, like a whole community version of adulthood that didn't involve alcohol. But I left that, and I left the church, and I left. And so I wanted to be different than that. So in addition to having sex before marriage, which I got to tell people, but it was not such a public thing that you do, drinking is quite a public thing. And it was quite a public statement that I was not like, I remember making it a big deal in my family that I was drinking, that because that would meant that I was not a Christian. And I having Oceana so young, it never really became a thing, because I had a little kid that I was chasing around trying to get through university. I was a bartender, and so I was serving the drinks, not so much drinking the drinks. But then when I got to my 30s and settled into, having somewhat older kids, and my little kids were kind of in that stage. And then I met the mommy wine culture and the corporate woman wine culture and the, like all these places where women escape to drink. And I'd been drinking more and more. The bottles of wine were just getting more expensive and nicer and more delicious, and it was becoming a more regular occasion. So I was to the point where I was drinking most nights, but I could have a glass or have three. Like I could control it from my perspective. I could go a week without, there was, I would say I was hyper controlled, not outer control, because I thought about it. I thought a lot about every drink. Mm-hmm. And then I went on a trip, and there was a woman that was about 10 years ahead of me. I had wanted to meet her so badly. Like I was so excited. It was the international trip. I knew she'd be there. So excited to connect with her. We planned a dinner, and long story short, she's yelling at the waiter, and I was like, it just was this window into my future. I was like, 10 years ago, this woman who I deeply respect, I think she had 2 kids, but still there's so many parallels. Yeah. And I was like, that's me. That's me in 10 years. She was me now. And this has just gone a little bit further. This isn't very much further. And I was like, I'm out. Like, I've got to try not doing this. And then it was in giving it up and how incredibly difficult it was that I was like, oh, okay. So I wasn't a problem drinker, but drinking is certainly a problem. It's certainly a problem. And then slowly I'd go back and forth between giving it up and going back to it. And then more recently, I've just been like, you know what, I'll drink whenever I want to, whenever I'm willing to give up the benefit that I get from not drinking. I'll have a drink, and all of a sudden I'm not having drinks.
Right. Suddenly that is not coming. Yeah. You know what's cool about that, Julia? I just noticed that as you were talking, is that this is another example of you looking off into the future, knowing what you want for yourself, and then making decisions that are going to get you there, which I know that sounds so obvious, like, duh, that's how we should go through life. But I just think a lot of us don't do that. And this is something that when I'm coaching around alcohol, I always encourage women to do, tap into that kind of genuine, authentic self, that, the Julia that you always were and you always are. And then imagine that person 5 years from now. What do they want for you in this moment around alcohol?
Yeah.
And what's different, and for me, that was a huge question when I decided to stop, or to start working on stopping anyway, was what is the evidence that this thing that has gotten consistently worse for me in the last 10 years, that in 5 years from now, this is going to be the same, better, or worse? And it was just so obvious. It was just going to be worse. This was going to be a harder problem for me to solve in 5 years. So if you're listening, ask yourself what you want for yourself in the future, and what you're doing what you're doing today is doing to get you closer to that or further away from that. I think it's such a great way to go through life. And we don't spend a lot of time thinking about that, but you can change your future by changing what you're doing today. So thanks for sharing that. And thanks for letting people know that it was still hard, because that's one thing I talk about all the time. You don't need to be, addicted or consider yourself to be, at the far end of the alcohol use disorder spectrum, or even, that word that we don't use anymore, an alcoholic, in order for it to be really freaking hard to drink less. It's hard for everyone to drink less. And I love the idea of, like, I may not have had a problem, but this is a problem. Alcohol is a problem. It is causing problems for me. Okay. Last thing really quick that I want to talk about, because I know we're coming close to time and I want to be respectful of that, is I just want to touch on, because this is also something that I was really impressed with, is how you take, because this is so important to me as someone who works in the corporate wellness world a lot and doing a lot of consulting, and I'm talking to people who are in the high level management positions about how they can change the culture around wellness and help promote balance and prevent burnout for their employees. And the thing I say over and over and over again is, you guys have to do it too.
Yeah.
It's not going to work to just bring people in to talk about this and to give your employees tools. You have to be role modeling this behavior. And I know how much you care about your staff. And I just wonder if you could just talk about that for a second. The role that your role plays in how you take care of yourself and how you show up.
Yeah, it's such a mind game you play with yourself, because the burnout badge, or the busy badge, is still, especially I think among women, this idea. And I was speaking to the women that I was in Cambodia with. So these are rural Cambodian women. And we did the 24-hour thing. So you take your 24 hours and hour by hour, talk to a group of people and say, well, what do you do? And then you take, in this case, their husband's 24 hours, and then you compare the two things. And so we did that exercise together, and we're talking about workload and balance and how, what it would mean if men took on more. And the one thing that they said they wanted, I said, well, what would you do with that time? Like, if men took on, some of the cooking of the rice that you have on your side, what would you do? And they all said rest. Like, it was so obvious. They're like, obviously we would rest. And I thought it was such a profound insight into the simplicity of what we want as women, and what is so often just robbed from us, by our own making, by society's making, by choices, by lack of choices. And we could talk about this for hours, but from my team perspective, what I try to, my team is predominantly women. And so what I try to do is take off the busy badge, take off the burnout badge, set it aside, but keep it in the room so we all know it's there. And we all talk about it. We all talk about how it's hard to say we're not busy. It's hard to say we're okay. It's hard to say those things. And then I put my stuff in the calendar and I tell people, heading out for my workout, let's take this meeting. Like this MP that I meet with on a regular basis, he's always telling people, it's like, Julia made me go for a walk during our meeting. He's in Edmonton, I'm here. He's like, Julia made me take this meeting as a walking meeting. And I was like, of course, don't you do that? He's like, I've never done that before. And I was like, okay. Because if I have a one-on-one meeting that we don't need to be sitting in front of the screen, put your headphones on and walk, right? And so I try to say those things over and over again, and I try to put them in my calendar. I talk about my workouts. I incorporate movement into when we are gathered in person. You know, everyone's coming here next week to Peterborough, and I'm inviting everyone to yoga. I'm inviting, you know, those who are able to do various activities. And yeah, it's like tending a garden. You got to just keep coming back to it, coming back to it, coming back to it. And like you said, you've got to model it. And
yeah. If people don't see the people in power and leadership roles doing the thing, they are going to assume they will be penalized for doing it. That's the reality of it. So they have to see them doing it, and they have to be encouraged to do it themselves. And then they have to be able to do it and not have repercussions from that. And so there are lots of different pieces that go into this, but paying lip service to wellness and balance is just a waste of money and time. And I wanted to ask you that question because this is not something I've talked about with any women leaders on this podcast yet, but I have had this conversation offline so many times with people. And I just love the way that you're doing this. Last but not least, what's the role of writing in your kind of your main maintenance of balance and prevention of burnout? Is it as big as it is for me? Because for me, it's like a key component. I put it right up there with like exercise and food. Where does it fit for you?
Completely. I mean, at 4 a.m. when I was awake and before my Orange Theory workout class, I was writing. Because maybe because I was meeting you today, I don't know, but I was thinking about one of the conversations we had about, you know, your 3 loves in life or whatever. And so I was writing, trying to use that framework. And I'm not an artist. I'm not a visual person. I'm not super detail oriented. Words are my creativity. They always have been, whether that's words that come when I'm speaking on stage or words that I put on paper. And I really believe we all need a creative outlet. And, you know, it took me a while to find mine. It's hard to prioritize, but there's such beauty in being creative. And then there's such beauty in having the gift of being able to share it. And I was thinking,
that community is such a critical, I feel like we're so lucky that our group, that we have each other and we have somewhere to share it. But if you're listening and you're thinking, you know I hammer home about this creativity piece all the time in the podcast, but if you're thinking that's the thing that's missing for me and I don't know what it is, just get out there and try stuff. You've all heard my stories of like felting and like watercolor painting and like, you know, all the various things that I tried before I found the thing. So you got to go out. It's like speed dating. You got to go out and try all the things and something will fit. And maybe you'll be lucky enough to find the community that I've found and the friendships that I've been able to create from it, including the friendship that I have with Julia. Thank you so much, Julia. This has been exactly what I hoped it would be in terms of a conversation. We were all over the place in terms of topics, but I think you just have there's so many pieces of your story that are so interesting and that are the types of things that I spend podcast episodes talking about. And I love the fact that we can cover all of these little things in a little, just like a little, what do we call it? Like a sampler plate. in one podcast. It's been really great. I really appreciate your time. I know how busy you are. And thank you. Thanks for agreeing to be on here today. It's been great.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I encourage everyone to check out our website and click on the partners, because that's what we want you to see.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to put the website in the show notes, guys. If you want to go check out CanWaCH, I will have the URL in the show notes for the podcast. Thank you, Julia. See you soon.
See you soon.
You've been listening to Bite Size Balance with your host, Wendy McCallum. As a burnout and balance coach, I help busy high achievers like you create a more balanced, joyful life. If you've been putting yourself last for way too long and are worried that you're burning out, grab your free burnout checklist at www.wendymccallum.com/checklist. That's www.wendymccallum.com/checklist.